You're learning French because you want to have conversations with French people, right? Well, most conversations start with small talk. In this lesson, I'm going to share with you 15 French phrases and questions you can use to make small talk with French people. What is the thing that everyone talks about when making small talk? I'm sure you can guess. It's the weather. Same in French. Everyone always talks about the weather. Now, one thing you might want to remember is that when making small talk, when just passing a comment, French people tend to just make a statement, whereas in English, people might be more likely to turn that into a question, like adding a question tag at the end of their statement. So, for example, someone might say something like, or you could say something like, Il fait beau aujourd'hui. Or, Il fait beau aujourd'hui, ça fait du bien. The weather's nice today. Or, the weather's nice today, it feels good. Right? But in English, you would be more likely to say, the weather's nice today, isn't it? Right? Can you see the difference? French people prefer statements here, whereas English people would prefer questions. Also, remember when talking about the weather in French, you need to use the verb faire followed by an adjective. For example, il fait beau. Now, faire technically means to do or to make, but of course we don't translate that word for word in English because here it wouldn't make any sense, okay? But just remember, faire is the verb for the weather. Il fait beau aujourd'hui. Ça fait du bien. The weather's nice today. It feels good. Now, if the weather is not nice, you could say il fait froid aujourd'hui. Il fait froid aujourd'hui. It's cold today. But I want to teach you a little something here to basically emphasize, to add emphasis to your statement. You can start the sentence with qu'est-ce que? Qu'est-ce qu'il fait froid aujourd'hui? Qu'est-ce qu'il fait froid aujourd'hui? Adding qu'est-ce, you may already know qu'est-ce from questions because we can also use that structure to ask questions. But just because qu'est-ce is here, it doesn't mean it's a question because in fact here it's not a question. Here it's just used to add feeling to your statement or to add emphasis to your statement, which basically becomes an exclamation. Qu'est-ce qu'il fait froid aujourd'hui? It's kind of like saying, God, it's so cold today, instead of just, it's cold. So if you want to add emphasis to your statement, you can add qu'est-ce at the beginning. Qu'est-ce qu'il fait froid aujourd'hui? Somewhat in the same vein, I'm sure you've heard the French expression oh la la before. It doesn't actually have a translation in English, but it is basically used to convey feelings, which can be either positive or negative. It all depends on your facial expression and your tone of voice. So obviously, if you're using oh la la, make sure that your voice and your facial expression actually match the meaning you want to convey. So for example, let's imagine the weather is terrible, which it is at the moment. I could say, oh là là, quel temps! Oh là là, quel temps! Obviously, oh là là doesn't have a direct translation, but it would mean, oh my God, what weather! Quel temps, word for word, would mean what weather. Oh là là, quel temps! Oh my goodness, what is the weather like today? Oh la la adds a lot of feeling, a lot of emphasis, basically. Very much like qu'est-ce, which we've just talked about. Now, moving on from the weather, people who already know each other are likely to engage in small talk, complaining about something that affects them in some way or something going on around them that they're both likely to agree with, because basically that's a bonding opportunity. So, for example, let's think about colleagues. Towards the end of the week, they might say something like La semaine a été longue, vivement le week-end. La semaine a été longue, vivement le week-end. The week was long, I can't wait for the weekend. And when they come back on a Monday, they might say something like Le week-end est passé trop vite. Le week-end est passé trop vite. The weekend went too fast. Can you relate? Le week-end est passé trop vite. La semaine a été longue. Le week-end est passé trop vite. Now, in case you don't know, if you're at the beginning of your French learning journey, I have a free 7-day course. The link is in the description. It includes everything you need to get started in the right order, including audio, pronunciation tips, grammar tips, mini conversations, and it will help you speak from day one. So if you're interested, click on the link in the description. Another thing you can do when making small talk is to comment on how busy the place you're in is. So if it's very busy, you could say something like Il y a du monde aujourd'hui. Il y a du monde aujourd'hui. There are a lot of people today. Basically, it's busy today. It's crowded today. Il y a du monde aujourd'hui. And remember, in French, we use il y a to mean both there is and there are, no matter whether what follows is in the plural or the singular. So, in French, you say il y a, even if what follows is plural. Whereas in English, you would say there is if what follows is singular, and there are if what follows is plural. Okay, so that's a difference that's worth keeping in mind. Il y a means there is and there are. Never use ils y ont because that's just not correct. That's not grammatical. And on the flip side, if it's very quiet, you can say something like C'est calme aujourd'hui. C'est calme aujourd'hui. It's quiet today. And of course, just like we discussed earlier, you can also use qu'est-ce que at the beginning if you want to add more feeling to your statement, more emphasis. So instead of saying c'est calme aujourd'hui, you could say qu'est-ce que c'est calme aujourd'hui? Qu'est-ce que c'est calme aujourd'hui? Qu'est-ce que c'est calme aujourd'hui? It's so quiet today. To start a conversation with someone you know, you could ask them what their plans are for the weekend. So you could ask, tu as quelque chose de prévu ce week-end? Tu as quelque chose de prévu ce week-end? Do you have something planned this weekend? Those people know each other, so that's an informal question. We are just using a statement and rising our intonation at the end to turn it into a question. That is not something you would use with someone you don't know. Okay, that's a structure for people who know each other. And because they know each other, they're using tu and not vous. Okay? Tu as quelque chose de prévu ce week-end? Do you have something planned for this weekend? And of course, sometimes it may be appropriate to ask them if they've had a nice weekend or if they've had a nice holiday, if they've just come back from a holiday. So for example, you could ask, tu as passé un bon week-end? Tu as passé un bon week-end? Did you have a nice weekend? Again, just rising intonation at the end of a statement. That is the most common way of asking a question if you know the person already. It's informal, but who wants to be formal with their friends or people they know well, right? Tu as passé un bon weekend? Did you have a nice weekend? And about someone's holiday, tu as passé de bonnes vacances? Tu as passé de bonnes vacances? Did you have a nice holiday? Now notice, de bonnes vacances in French is plural, whereas a holiday in English is singular. Okay, so remember in French, vacances, which means holiday, is always plural. So don't say tu as passé une bonne vacance, because that would be wrong. You need to say tu as passé de bonnes vacances with an S at the end of bonnes and vacances if you're writing it. Tu as passé de bonnes vacances? Did you have a nice holiday? Vacances, always plural. Now, if you wanted to engage in conversation with someone you know, you could ask them about their family. One way to do that, if they have children, is to ask comment va la petite famille? Comment va la petite famille? Comment va la petite famille? La petite famille is a colloquial phrase that encompasses the children and the spouse if they have one, basically their family unit. How is everyone? How is the family is what this means. Comment va la petite famille? Comment va la petite famille? How is the family? If you just want to focus on the children, you could say les enfants vont bien? Les enfants vont bien? Are the children okay? How are the children doing? Les enfants vont bien? Remember, when asking how someone is in French, we use the verb aller, not the verb to be, as you would in English. Aller technically means to go. So it's somewhat like saying, how is it going? How are the children going? Not that it makes sense, but you get my drift, right? Remember, aller is the verb to use to ask how someone is. Les enfants vont bien? Comment va la petite famille? Aller both times. And of course, if you wanted to just ask the person how they are themselves, you would just say, comment ça va? Comment ça va? How are you? How is it going? And if you just want an update or to know if there is anything going on in their life, anything new that you don't already know, you can ask that informally with quoi de neuf? Quoi de neuf? What's new? What's up? Quoi de neuf? But that's very informal, so only really use that with friends. Now let's see what we can say to strangers. Let's imagine you're visiting a place and there's someone beside you want to talk to. You could ask them, vous venez ici souvent? Vous venez ici souvent? Do you come here often? Or, c'est la première fois que vous venez ici? C'est la première fois que vous venez ici? Is this the first time you come here? Now notice, they're strangers, so we're using vous now, not tu. To make small talk, you can also ask people if they've heard about something that's topical at the time, for example, something that's on the news. To do this, you would use the phrase avez-vous entendu parler de? Have you heard about? Avez-vous entendu parler des inondations à Paris? Avez-vous entendu parler des inondations à Paris? Have you heard about the floods in Paris? Of course, there is no flood in Paris, at least not at the moment. This is just an example. Avez-vous entendu parler de, followed by your topic? Avez-vous entendu parler de literally means, have you heard talking about? In French, you can't omit parler, even though in English you would be likely to not use that. You would just say, have you heard about, not have you heard talking about. But in French, you must use parler in this instance. Avez-vous entendu parler de? Have you heard about? And last but not least, if the context is appropriate, you could ask someone what they do for a living, what they do as a job. Vous faites quoi comme travail? Vous faites quoi comme travail? Or, vous faites quoi dans la vie? Vous faites quoi dans la vie? What do you do as a job? What do you do for a living? Of course, you wouldn't ask that in a queue at the supermarket. But you know, some contexts may be appropriate to ask that question as small talk. You be the judge. Now remember to click on the link in the description if you want to sign up for my free course. I'll be happy to see you there. But this is it for me today. À la prochaine. Bye.